You can't send a rocket out to space without math. You can't look at particles at the Large Hadron Collider without math. Math is all around us, even in our daily lives, even in splitting tips at a restaurant.
What's up, everybody? From Nautilus, I'm Brian Gallagher, and you're watching Behind the Scenes. Today, I'm speaking with Elizabeth Landau. Elizabeth is a science journalist who has contributed to outlets like the New York Times, the Washington Post, Wired, and more. She's also a senior communications specialist at NASA headquarters, where she produces and edits podcasts, videos, and articles. Her recent story in Nautilus was titled, "Are All Brains Good at Math? Math Provokes Dread in So Many People, Yet We're All Born with a Sense for Numbers." Elizabeth, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
So Elizabeth, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, a brief background, how you got into science writing, and what your feelings are about math?
Sure, yeah. So I've always loved science from the time I was a child, and I've also always loved writing. It wasn't until I went to college that I realized that this was something that I could do in combination. I took an amazing seminar called Life on Mars, or Maybe Not, when I was a freshman, and that really put me on this path toward it. This really put me on the path towards communicating science, reporting on science, working with scientists to tell their stories, as well as going off of my own path and asking questions and asking scientists, like, how do they go about their work? I've always loved math as a child. At the same time, I did reach a point in college when I took multivariable calculus where I finally hit a wall. I thought to myself, I don't see the relevance of this anymore. I don't think I'm going to use this anymore. And I didn't take any more math. But now that I'm a science writer and I work with so many people who do amazing things because of math, you can't send a rocket out to space without math. You can't look at particles at the Large Hadron Collider without math. Math is all around us, even in our daily lives, even in splitting tips at a restaurant. So I wanted to really look at this question of why do people dread math so much? And that led me to write this piece.
Why don't you give us a brief summary of the story for our viewers who may not have read it yet?
Sure, yeah. So I kind of looked at it as, how could math be more accessible to more people from an education perspective, but also what does the psychological science and the neuroscience tell us about how our brains are wired for math or not? And I found out that actually not only humans, but actually a lot of animals, they have some inherent sense of numerosity. And by that, I mean kind of estimating how many of a thing is in front of you. That's actually a really critical skill. If you are out in the wilderness and there's a certain number of predators, you want to know, are there a lot, or is there maybe one or none? Knowing relatively or in some approximate way how many things are out there is actually very fundamental, not only for humans, but also for other animals. However, humans are the only animals that can use symbols to think about numbers and can perform, very complex tasks with numbers. By talking to some education experts, we talked about there's this sort of conflict between, do you teach math as something that you memorize or something that you understand in a fundamental way? And of course, it's both. Like, you have to practice and memorize and practice these procedures to manipulate numbers, to manipulate variables, but also you have to have some kind of understanding of why you're doing that. So those are the kinds of topics that I covered in my piece.
What was your impetus or inspiration for writing this particular story?
Yeah, I guess, with school starting up again for a lot of people out there, I just, over my lifetime, I hear every now and again, like, oh, I'm so bad at math. I hate math. And I really wanted to know, like, what is that all about? And, in talking to different researchers and reading about it, I mean, there really are a lot of negative stereotypes out there about who can be good at math and who can't be, but also just that idea of I am a good math person, that is, in and of itself is a fallacy, because just like with anything else, like you can improve, you can get better at it. And so I kind of wanted to find out, what is the latest thinking about how people could improve, whether it's in school or otherwise.
What were some of your first thoughts on how to go about reporting the story?
Yeah, I actually had a bit of a journey reporting this, because I was at first very fixated on the neuroscience, on what can just brain imaging tell us about the math learning process and how math is processed in the brain. And I quickly learned that actually, even though in the last 20 years there's been a lot of research about math and the brain, at the same time, that research is very new, and it's really not at a level where you could take something that you would learn from a neuroscience study and apply it in a classroom. Maybe someday that will happen, but we're not there yet. So, in order to sort of fill the gap, I then sort of turned to more cognitive psychology and education research to see what was out there. I also wanted to look at this aspect called math anxiety. It's actually not just like something that somebody made up. Like, people suffer math anxiety. They legitimately freeze up. They legitimately like sweat and worry a lot when they're put into a situation about doing math. And so, I wanted to see what that was about as well.
Can you see a little bit more about that? What do we know about math anxiety? And is it something that seems to be heritable, for example, or is it something that is sort of learned where people become under the impression that for whatever reason they're just not a math person?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm not sure if there have been any studies about heritability per se, but one thing is that if your teacher shows math anxiety, the students are more likely to have math anxiety. Or I think there is something going on with the transmission of fear and anxiety about numbers. When a lot of people have negative experiences with math in school, then they have children and they say to their children, oh no, you're going to have math, it's going to be hard. That in and of itself is already transmitting anxiety even before the child has even had a chance to see for themselves how do they feel about it. So I think there is something cultural going on, but also, as with any kind of anxiety, it's a legitimate issue for mental health, and we need to recognize it and help kids when they have that.
Was there anything notably hard or difficult about reporting this story?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I had in my mind a lot of different concepts. I mean, there's so many ways to talk about math and the way that we do math, the way that we process math in our brains. And I also really wanted to have the goal of having a story that anybody could get something from and not feel like it was condescending. In and of itself, in sort of cultural terms, we think of math as this sort of elite topic. Like, if you're good at it, you're somehow elite in some way. But that's really not true. Like, math is literally for everybody. We do it all the time, even if we don't realize it, even in the sort of adding and subtracting way. And, I guess I wanted people to be able to enjoy the story, maybe think about the way that they think about numbers a little bit differently.
Can you share any interesting bits from your research or reporting that didn't make it in the final draft for whatever reason?
Sure, yeah. Again, I went down all kinds of different roads. I mean, I will say that uh, at one time I thought to focus a little bit more on kids that actually do have learning disabilities. There's something called dyscalculia, which is the analog of dyslexia, but for math as opposed to dyslexia having to do with reading. And there is a lot of research on whether those two are related. It seems like they can go hand in hand, and they often do. One researcher actually told me that she gets calls from parents, please scan my child's brain. Like, again, that's not going to be productive. We're really not at the point where we can have a fMRI scanner in a school and have any insights into any particular child. But there are a lot of desperate parents out there with kids who are legitimately struggling. So that point kind of drove that home for me. Another thing that struck me was that our brains, we are primed for estimation, as I mentioned, but actually there is a lot of controversy about that when you start talking about these animal studies. To what extent is a chimpanzee really adding? To what extent does a honeybee really understand the concept of zero? The sort of almost philosophical question of whether a non-human animal understands what a number is. I think that there is something there. I might like to explore that in a future piece. Like what does that really mean? Like, does a number to us really mean what a number means to a non-human animal? That researchers actually do disagree on to what extent a non-human animal really knows what they're doing in that respect.
In the piece, you say that you're well known for hosting Pi Day parties. What does a typical Pi Day party look like? What do you do? And yeah, what do the festivities look like?
I'm so glad you asked. So actually, I've been interested in the number pi since I was 13 years old. I got this book called The Joy of Pi. And ever since, I was just so interested in this number that is literally all around us, the circumference to diameter of a circle with its digits going on forever in the seemingly random fashion. And the fact that March 14th, 314, can be celebrated as Pi Day. Actually, the San Francisco Exploratorium claims to have sort of invented the idea of celebrating Pi Day, at least in the US, in a big way. I've never actually made it out there. There are many science museums that have activities for kids now on March 14th. My Pi Day parties, I usually have everybody just make a pie, and sometimes we'll do like a pie recitation type of thing. At one point, I did know, I think, 170 digits of pi. I retained most of them, but it's also a fun thing. Like I have had friends over the years who also have memorized a lot of digits of pi. I know this is very nerdy, but it is very fun to like have like a pi off with another person who has also memorized a lot of pi. And because of this random hobby of mine, I own like this pie scarf right here, and a lot of pie jewelry and things that I will wear on Pi Day. So it is a really fun and quirky thing. At bare minimum, you can have some pie on Pi Day. And I have noticed over the years that actually more like pizza parlors and pie shops and things like have recognized Pi Day, and they often have discounts on March 14th.
Right on. That's awesome. I love that scarf.
Thanks.
Um, do you have any philosophical intuitions about how deep math goes? And I think Eugene Wigner has that famous paper about like the curious effectiveness of mathematics in the natural sciences. I think Max Tegmark has argued that we don't just describe reality with math. Math at bottom is, or reality is at bottom math. What do you think? Are numbers real? Are they fundamentally the most real thing, or are they just useful things that humans use to describe and understand the world?
Oh my gosh, I love that question. I mean, it gets so deep into like what even is reality, these laws of physics that we have, which of course are based on math. Albert Einstein keeps being right time and time again. His math actually wasn't super difficult, but he had this intuition about the way that the world works in terms of relativity and all of these things. It I do feel like there's some sense in which people who have these great ideas involving math that they are tapping into these fundamental laws of the universe. And every day when you add some numbers together or you split a check at a restaurant, in a way you are tapping into this fundamental fabric of the universe that we've all agreed upon. Now, that doesn't mean that someday we're not going to discover that some of those laws of physics are different. I think someday, we will have a telescope powerful enough to maybe prove Einstein wrong in some ways. But I do think that there's something fundamental to, not only do we as humans have sense for number, but that this idea of estimation could be shared even by animals. I think there's something there that we are tapping into some underlying fabric.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. Um, can you share anything about the impact this story has had after it published? Can you say anything about any kind of response you've seen online or elsewhere to what you've had to say about learning math and math anxiety?
Yeah, well, I have seen it tweeted, and I was really happy to see that some of the people quoted in the story enjoyed it. I haven't had the opportunity to really discuss it much yet, but I do hope that people enjoy it and get something out of it. Again, especially as people go back to school, or there are people out there who maybe they never did advance in math beyond algebra and they're curious about what's out there. There's no reason that you can't go on a website like Coursera or edX and take a higher math class, take a number theory class. Like, it's never too late to learn something new. And maybe math feels like the most intimidating thing that you could learn, but it's really not. It's just like anything else. Like, if you want to do it, if you want to learn about what is possible with math, there are so many resources out there, and I encourage you to check it out.
What are you working on right now?
Well, there's so many projects that I have percolating in my mind, in my sort of other life with the work that I do at NASA. I do write about the new images from the James Webb Space Telescope, which are just mind blowing, of these star forming regions. And we just put out these images of Jupiter. Again, these are big cosmic things, and scientists do describe them with math to bring it back to that. But yeah, I'm so curious about the latest findings about space, about psychology, all these things.
Do you want to tell our viewers where they can find you online to see more of your work and follow whatever you're putting out there?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, my website is lizlandau.com, and you can find me on Twitter at Liz Landau. Both of those places are the best to keep up with what I'm doing.
All right, Liz, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate your time.
This has been really fun. Thank you so much.